Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me for a special Superman comics buying guide is first-time guest Nick Farina. Nick, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Anthony. I'm excited to be here, and God knows we have a lot to talk about, my friend.
We have a lot to talk about. We have a lot in common, as we were discovering off mic. And one of the connection points, and I want to start here, I want to start with your Superman fan journey and specifically how you got started in all of this.
Sure.
Because as I have gathered from following you on social media, I think our origin stories are eerily similar. So let me toss it to you. How'd you get into all of this?
Well, Superman, like many children of the 80s, was always on my radar. I remember it would be a big deal when 7:00 on a Sunday night, they would show Superman the movie. And I was born in 1985. I'm almost 38 years old now. So when I was growing up, my Superman was still Christopher Reeve. So that was my very first introduction to the character. That's what made me fall in love with the character. And then, the toy chains of the 80s were a big part of, stoking the fires. I remember finding the Superpower Superman at a neighbor's garage sale a few years after it came out, but it was still in pretty good condition. And just, having that and just like the cloth cape and just associating that with Christopher Reeve was what really put it on my radar. And now I know what's coming. With Superman on my radar in 1992, there was a boy sitting across from me at the lunch table, and they knew that I was a Superman fan. His eyes opened wide, and he says, "Did you hear? Doomsday killed Superman." And in my mind, it's okay. What's a Doomsday? So he said, it's a character. It's a monster. He killed Superman. But I had no idea what that means. And, not to be overly dramatic, but it's funny. It's like my dad will tell me stories about the boy who told him that Kennedy got shot. It's just like you remember where you were in the moment that you heard like Superman. When you grow up looking at Christopher Reeve and watching Superboy, the TV series, and then you hear he died. Okay, well, what does that mean to a 7-8-year-old? That's huge news. And when I was walking out of, this is going to make me sound real cool, piano lessons, there was a comic shop that was adjacent to where I was having piano lessons as an 8-year-old. And in that shop window, it was February 1993, so it had just come out, was the trade paperback of The Death of Superman. I was too young to make it to the comic shop in November of 1992. So I missed the event itself, but boy, was I there once they put it in a collected edition. And I remember, of course, like any 8-year-old would, I flipped to the last few pages before I had taken it in, which to my credit, I did read it front to back immediately after. But seeing those images of Superman being beaten to death, it had a huge, huge impact on me. And Dan Jurgens, to his credit, did not hold back. It's a book literally about Superman sacrificing himself and allowing himself to be beaten to death in the streets of Metropolis while the people he loves most watches on. And to a kid, I'm sure to adults it meant everything, but to a kid, obviously, I was hooked. And shortly after that, a couple months later, the return event started in April 1993 with Adventures of Superman number 500 in Jerry Ordway's swan song as when he left the books. I was there for that. In fact, I remember seeing the white poly bag in Toys R Us of all things, and just knowing, okay, knowing what it was, that it had to mean the return. My mom, to her credit, must have just seen the look on my face, because if there was an argument, I don't remember one. I just remember taking it home. And from then on, that was the first time from Adventures of Superman number 500 on that I was following a comic issue to issue as much as I could, because admittedly, like, this is back during the Triangle era when they were pumping these out every single week. But I kept up as much as I could all the way to the return. And that's what cemented me as a lifelong fan of the character, that story in particular. So that those are my beginnings.
That's fantastic. And like I said, seeing you post about seeing the trade in that window display for the Death of Superman and how it just caught your eye and it pulled you in, that again is nearly identical to the experience that I had. And it's one of those things where on the one hand, maybe part of me might feel like, oh, I'm less unique, but that I go the other way. And the idea that someone had that same kind of experience, right?
Sure.
And we know exactly what we're talking about. There's that kinship there. And I really love that. And that's one of the things growing up all those years. And I've talked about this, like, there weren't really kids in my class who were into comic books. It wasn't until I got into my high school years and I was working at my local comic shop. And then all of that kind of opened up and I started making friends who were into this. But even still, I think it's only been more recently, especially with the 30th anniversary of the Death of Superman, where like it's become clear now how many other people got into comics or into Superman or back into comics or Superman with the Death of Superman. And I love it. Like, I love to be part of that. It's fantastic.
Absolutely. And, I have to say, I think history being awfully kind to this story and all the homages we see and all the media we see that incorporates the Death of Superman's story. For a long time, you'd have to, parry attacks from people claiming that it was a gimmick or that it was done solely to sell books. History being kind to it and people revering it the way that they do. Again, especially, I think, as you were saying, cemented by the 30th anniversary celebration and the additions that they put out, the omnibus that they spruced up a bit with a new cover. You can point to all different, avenues of media where they've honored that story. And it keeps coming, and it's still relevant today. So it's no wonder that it touched so many people the way that it did.
No, absolutely. Well, so on this note of collected editions and omnibuy and all of that, so let's get into our Superman comics buying guide. Yep. I'm really excited. I can't wait to compare notes. I want to give a shout out to one of our patrons, James Hart, because this episode was actually born out of a suggestion that he made. He reached out to me a while back via Patreon, and I want to read part of his message because this really kind of got the wheels turning and led to us being here. He said, I was thinking, man, I'd really like to get into the comic book side of Superman. I'm predominantly a film Superman person on the whole, aside from Smallville, so I'm thinking it would be great to dive into the comic books. I do have All-Star Superman and Birthright given to me as a gift, but that's pretty much all I have. So as someone who's not really experienced in comic books, it's quite apprehensive approaching looking at where to even begin. I know that with comic books, the whole part of the fun is trying out a brand new comic and just giving it a whirl, but for someone who's not really engaged much in comic books, that concept brings on the dread. What if I pick one that's rubbish? Or what if I pick one that's part of a 30-issue story and I picked the middle issue? And don't even get me started on the DC app. All that to say, I was thinking it'd be really cool if you did an episode whereby you laid out the fundamentals of Superman comic book reading with different spending budgets curated from your knowledge. So shout out to James, because I thought that was such a great idea.
It's so succinct. Yeah. You have to remind yourself as an avid fan, not everybody, like, it's very easy to look at the history of Superman, and this is 86 years, and just feel like overwhelmed by it and not know where to begin. For Superman nerds like you and I, it's very easy for us to go, wow, you would start in the modern age with XYZ. But that means nothing to a lot of people. They don't know what the modern age is. They don't know, these things that are so matter of factly to people who are avid readers. It's easy to feel overwhelmed. So I hope our picks, and also one thing I do want to point out before I give my list is, if I don't name something that is on Anthony's list or on your list, it doesn't negate it. I have my own relationship with Superman. Anthony has his relationship with Superman. There's going to be some similarities, but there's going to be some differences, and that's cool. So the suggestions that I'm going to give are just from my purview as a fan. But they're ones that I'm really excited about. And I think that if you are new to Superman, these picks are going to be, within a budget that's doable, but will give you a good view of who I believe the character is.
Yeah. So over the course of this episode, we'll talk about reading and collecting generally. We'll answer some questions. We'll play a little bit of a game where we give ourselves hypothetical budgets and we have to make selections within that. So we'll get into all of it. But to your point and to James's point, I too needed to be reminded of the fact that not everyone is as immersed in the comic book side of this. Some are not at all. And
sure.
Not only do we have that question from James, but others reached out as well expressing a similar sentiment. So I hope that we can perform some sort of service with this episode. But also, I do get it. I really get it, because I was thinking about this. Yes, with Superman, the comics were there from the start, and they've always been there. Even for that nearly decade-long stretch from the New 52 until I started this podcast in 2020, where I wasn't reading as much and as regularly as I had been. The comics were still always there. Mm-hmm. They were still always a part of my life. But there are other characters where my sole really exposure to them has been through other media, and I haven't necessarily been moved to explore them elsewhere. I can't say that there's much on the DC side, but Marvel's an easy example. Mm-hmm. Loved Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, as Tony Stark. Watched all of his appearances in the movies. They were great. At no point did I say, oh, I really want to go dive into Iron Man comics and see what the best runs are and get into all of that. I know there's great stuff out there, but I got my fill of it from watching those performances on the big screen. That was sufficient for me. I didn't feel that need to kind of take that next step. So whether someone's in that category or probably more relevantly, they want to take that next step, but they don't know where. I totally get it.
It's funny you say that, because I have a very similar relationship with Marvel. Where, there's points like, I was huge on the Marvel cartoons in the 90s. And I went through a phase where I collected Marvel Masterpiece cards. It's like I equate them with the band Nirvana, where I've always appreciated them more than I've really, been into them. That's my relationship with Nirvana. And that's my relationship with Marvel, rather, that there's a lot to appreciate. And I've gotten all my appreciation, I think, from the recent films as well.
Totally. Now, I have a few disclaimers. The disclaimers will probably be half the episode, but I'll try to move through them. But they really are important, and I want to get your take on all of this too. First of all, though, even before a disclaimer, I got to tell you, because again, we're going to play this little game where we have our budgets and we make our picks. And I know this is going to sound like such a dumb, obvious statement, but it really struck me as I was putting these picks together. And I essentially went shopping on my bookshelf. Like I went over to the bookcase and I was like, all right, and I was picking them out. And then I was flipping them over.
You got my homework right here.
Excellent. And I was flipping them over and I was looking at the prices. And I was like, oh, this is a very expensive hobby. Again, another thing I take for granted, because it's just been part of my life. It's not, oh, money's no object. It's not that. It's just that it's been part of my life for so long. It's not this extra thing for me. It's just, well, no, I get comics. And plus I have the added benefit of doing this podcast. So for tax purposes and with my wife and with myself, I'm always like, well, it's for the pod. I'm ordering all of these Superman in the Golden Age omnibus editions. I'm like, well, it's for the podcast. But it's expensive.
You're enriching yourself. That's worth its weight.
Yeah. But all right, some disclaimers. This, I'm really going to try not to say this over and over throughout the episode, but I'll probably fail. So don't make a drinking game out of this. It depends. Now, I happen to be a lawyer. If anyone listening is a lawyer or spends a lot of time with lawyers, that's kind of the lawyer's most frequent favorite answer. It depends. Because often it does depend. It depends on the specific circumstances and what we're talking about. And so, and this harkens right back to what you were saying a moment ago, where we're making our picks based on our experience, our preferences, and also trying to, put together a list that would set someone, a new fan, up for success with all of this. But we're also kind of doing this in a vacuum, in that we're addressing this to the general hypothetical new reader. If we were to sit down with someone and get a sense of what their experience with comics, if any, might be, and what their prior experience with Superman and other media is. Of course, then that would shift how we tailor our recommendations. So I have two quick examples that I'll give just to kind of show what I'm talking about. Like, no disrespect to the Peter Tomasi, Patrick Gleason Rebirth run on the Superman title. People love that. I didn't get quite as much mileage out of it, but they're lovely comics. And I know for people who were traumatized by the New 52, it was very soothing to segue into that Rebirth era.
that you know what? I'm not going to lie. I very much fell into that category. But I don't find myself, strangely enough, revisiting Rebirth, that is, very often. But in fact, that was the last time I followed comics regularly. I'm about to go back with the Warworld saga because I have a lot of catch up to do with that. But the last time I followed issue to issue was Rebirth. So I was one of those people who was heartbroken when it came to an end, especially when Dan Jurgens said that his next storyline would have included Conduit, which 90s fans needs no introduction. Kenny Braverman. It was a great storyline in 1994, 1995. But that was going to be the next, and that kind of broke my heart a little bit.
That broke my heart as well. I don't know that I still don't know that I'm over that one. But
I wish I could unhear it.
I know that I made it worse. But all that to say that the Tomasi Gleason Rebirth run is not on my list of recommendations. However, if you're out there listening to this and your favorite incarnation of Superman is the Superman and Lois TV show, and you love it because you like the family dynamic, you love Lois and Clark married, a little bit older, living on the farm, raising their boys, then I think that Peter Tomasi, Patrick Gleason Rebirth run would be a perfect fit for you. And I might even go so far as to recommend the Omnibus, which collects the entire run in this beautiful, oversized hardcover. Or if you were looking to maybe not dive in quite so deep so fast, maybe pick up the first volume in softcover. So that's one where it would depend on kind of what someone's interest is. So that's kind of one of the first examples of that kind of came to mind. One other thing I wanted to say at the outset was, and this kind of actually goes back to James's question about part of the joy being that kind of taking a chance and just letting something catch your eye, like what happened to us as kids with the Superman. And so that I wanted to address that because when I think about my own experience over all of these years, and I think about what hooked me on certain characters, in basically every instance, it was that spontaneous moment of discovery. It was seeing an issue on the shelf at the comic shop and being struck by the cover and picking it up and giving it a shot. And I think a lot about how my experience has changed entirely. I never buy something cold without first having read about it, read interviews, read previews, right? But when I think back to some of those pure moments of discovery, they're magical and they hooked me on those characters. The Flash 152 by Mark Waid, right after the Chain Lightning saga that introduced the Dark Flash, later revealed to be Walter West from Hypertime. Yeah. And that dark cover with the stark white background. I mean, I remember seeing that. It wasn't even at my local comic shop. I was visiting another one in the area, but it happened to be a Wednesday and they had the new books out. And I remember I saw it, I was like, and I grabbed it. That made me a Flash fan. When Gail Simone and Ed Benes took over Birds of Prey, that first cover with Dinah on the cover, like it just popped on the shelf and I picked it up. So I've had all of these instances of meeting these characters in that way. Now, at the same time, to James's point, like I know it can be daunting to go about it that way and you don't know if you're picking up the right thing and you don't know if you're jumping in the middle of a story and all that. And there's the cost factor involved. So I appreciate all of that. And again, hopefully this episode will help guide. But at the same time, to this prospective new comics reader who might be listening to this, do allow yourself some freedom for spontaneity and discovery. And know that you have a lot of tools at your disposal. Even if you pick up something and you read it and you're like, oh, I feel like I'm missing some context. You have Wikipedia, you have all of these resources out there. And also too, not to get too meta about this, but you have this podcast as well. I mean, I would say to our audience, especially our longtime listeners, we've covered a lot of comics on the show. So While we're going to make some specific recommendations here, anything that we've covered, if you've listened to the episode on it and you thought, oh, like that sounds kind of interesting, go for it. And virtually every time we talk comics, I list the issues that we're talking about. So there's at least some kind of starting point for you. So again, there are a lot of resources out there, but yeah, do allow yourself some room. I mean, I don't know how you feel about that.
No, I agree, because to your point, it's a lot of it is a feeling. And that harkens back to when you were a kid, the way that you met these characters, especially like during big points during Reign of the Superman, where you saw a cover. I remember seeing Superman, the collector's edition of Superman 82. And this is at my local grocery store, back when every grocery store had a comic rack randomly placed. I think mine was by the bread aisle. But I remember seeing it there and just the feeling that it gives it. But you need to trust that feeling when you see it too, when it comes to this, because it's going to be a personal decision.
Now, this next part, this is not a disclaimer, but it is a question for you that'll tee up the lists that we're going to share. And the answer might be different in terms of whether I'm asking you what you recommend for people versus what you prefer for yourself. They might be different. I don't know. But in terms of format, what do you tend to gravitate towards? Because, I mean, first of all, we have the entire digital side, digital versus print. And then and then there are subcategories, right? So if we're talking about reading comics digitally, you can buy digital comics and quote unquote own them as much as you can own anything that you don't have in your physical possession
that you don't own.
But you can buy digital comics through Comixology. You can read digital comics through, relevant here, the DC Universe Infinite app, where you pay a monthly or annual subscription fee and you can read the comics that are available on the service. So there's the digital side. Then there's the print side, right? And when we're talking physical comics, we have the single issue comics that release monthly, 22 pages, or maybe 20 now, I think. But we've got the single issue monthly comics. And then we have our collected editions or graphic novels. And there is a distinction, but those often kind of get lumped together. But our collected editions, which will take anywhere from 6 to 50 single issues and bind them together, depending on what kind of format we're talking about. Because we have the thinner soft covers, we have deluxe edition hardcovers, we have the really thick omnibus editions that will collect, again, could be 50 or more issues. There's also that oversized absolute format. That's a very specific kind of prestige presentation of the material. So all collecting a different volume of material and at different price points and all of that. All that to say, what do you tend to gravitate toward?
Well, I would have to say my preference would be trade paperback easily. And that's not to say that I don't have plenty of the others, but it's just by the nature of the time that I became a fan and what I would read that went on before, like, which would really be pre-death. Like everything pre-death of Superman are things that are stories that I've had to rediscover through trade paperback. And then, one nicer, like you said, the absolute editions or the more recent, Man of Steel hardcover editions, you collect that along the way. But initially, it's just the feel of trade paperbacks and, in the smell too, just the way that they feel. It takes me back to a moment in time when I'm reading a trade paper, even if it's a newer story. It just the feel of it. That's an easy one for me.
Gotcha. So are you, because I know some people are like really into the omnibus format, for example. Is that something that holds much appeal for you? Because I've had a journey with those.
I had to get the Death of Superman omnibus, just because, in a lot of ways with the Death of Superman story, I'm a completist, where I need to have at least like one of every piece of media that comes out. It's a dangerous game, but every time they pump something out from the Death of Superman, I'm in hook, line, and sinker. But the omnibus, it doesn't feel nice. When you're holding it, when you're trying to follow it, it's very difficult. I remember when I was young, my dad had this big, heavy book about the Civil War, and it was a pictorial history. And I remember, like, it has the same feel as that, where like I'm doing work, turning the pages. So, where there's something to be said for having an extended, oftentimes over a year's worth of comics in one physical spot. That's exciting, but it, and that may be someone's preference. I'm sure there's plenty of omnibus people out there that are saying, "What are you talking about? It's great." That may be true, but for me personally, I think that they're cumbersome. And other than the death of Superman, I know they did one for Exile, and I know they're doing one again. And they might have me here. They're starting to collect the Triangle Era.
Yeah. So this was very recently announced, the Triangle Era Omnibus Volume 1 coming out. I have to double check the release date, but I think fall 2024 or thereabouts.
September.
Thank you. So that's coming soon. I do want to give just a quick bit of info and a plug. So I do another show called Another Exciting Episode in the Adventures of Superman. We go episode by episode through the classic George Reeves television series. So number one, we're back. The show is back and we're getting into our season 2 discussions. But I just recorded an upcoming episode with longtime Superman comics editor Mike Carlin. And it was a fun episode talking about the episode Jet Ace from season 2 of the George Reeves show. One of the things that we talked about on mic at the end, but we also talked more off mic as well, was about this new line of Triangle Era omnibus editions and what he said. And this is in the show at the end. DC has, as quote unquote, elaborate plans to go year by year through the Triangle Era. But of course, it's all contingent on people pre-ordering it through their local comic shops and buying these. But in success, the idea really is to keep going through all of this, which is, it's one of those things where it's like, well, of course, that seems like a no-brainer. But we have experienced many instances where these lines start and then just kind of sputter out and we don't see them completed. And that's something that I'm sure we'll talk more about. But yeah, I was very excited to see that.
Mike's the man. He's the Phil Jackson of the Triangle Era, where he was quarterbacking all that behind the scenes. So a lot of those goodies are to his credit. That's really exciting.
Yeah. And now, so do you do digital comics at all?
I've dabbled. And it's a neat thing to tinker with, especially like, the comics where like, you click on the picture and it zooms right in, but it's just, to me, it's, and again, this is just for me personally. It's a feeling of like holding something there physically, where as a fan, that's always, and I'll be an old man saying that I want to, that I prefer physical media when it comes to what I'm reading, or, especially for comics. But yeah,
I've been a bit of a convert in recent years. So for a while, I really was resistant to digital comics for exactly the same reason that you're explaining, and that I'm sure a lot of people listening to this identify with, that wanting to hold and feel the book that you're reading, and that collector mindset of wanting to have it on your shelf and own it. And that, I think, kept me away from digital comics for a while. I tried once years ago when I had an iPad mini, and I was like, this is too small. I can't, it's not working for me. And then a few years ago, I said, well, let me give this another shot. I was curious enough, and I bought an iPad Pro. I got the biggest screen that you can get. And essentially, it mimics the size of your comic book page. So sitting there on the couch holding it, it feels like holding a book, and it's the same dimensions essentially. And that definitely got me more into the idea of reading digital comics. And again, it depends. I think it's different for everyone. And I look at digital comics as a tool that may or may not work for you. And, we're going to make our recommendations of, books you should get as a budding Superman comics reader within these various budget levels. But everyone's budget is different. And if maybe all you can spare is $8 a month for a subscription to the DC app, do that. Better that than not read comics at all. So,
certainly.
It's there as a tool. And I also think it can be a great way to at least sample something. And then maybe you go to your local comic shop and you're like, hey, I read this issue and it was really great. I'm not really sure where to go from here. And if you have a great comic shop, they'll be able to make those connection points. And kind of on that note, this is my last disclaimer, and then we'll get into it. But my heart is always with comic shops. I, of course, had that formative experience outside Heroes World. And then the late, great alternate realities in Scarsdale, New York. I shopped, worked, and hung out there for many, many years. And it closed almost a decade ago now, which is crazy, but so formative. If not for those two comic shops and then all the comic book stores that I went to on my travels with my other podcast, My Comic Shop History, and the documentary that I did, My Comic Shop Country, I probably wouldn't be here doing this podcast. And so I've been to a lot of stores and a lot of great stores. And we have 3 comic shops, All Yeah Comics, Fat Moose Comics, and Acme Comics that are sponsors of this podcast. And if I didn't think they were good shops, I would politely say, no, thank you. But I'm happy to have them as sponsors because I have been in those shops and I've seen the proprietors in action, and I filmed them. I have evidence of them making the kinds of connections that we're talking about, where you come in. This was the other example that I was going to share before, and it slipped my mind, but the Bendis Superman run is another one that's not on my list, but the owner of Acme Comics in North Carolina, Jermaine Exum, big Bendis fan, personal friend of the man. Bendis books might be on his list of recommendations if he were doing this episode. But it's like if someone came into his store and said, I want to get into Superman comics, and maybe they have some background in comics. Maybe they've been a Marvel zombie for most of their reading career, and Bendis is their favorite writer. Like, I love Ultimate Spider-Man, and I love Daredevil, and I love Alias and New Avengers, and I want to get into Superman. Not to speak for Jermaine, but I imagine he would, and I would say, oh, well, Bendis had this run on the Superman books. Why don't you start with this Man of Steel miniseries that he did? It really sets up the world and the supporting cast that he's going to use. It tees up the storylines. It gives you a sense of how Bendis approaches the character and captures the voice, which I do think is the strongest suit of his run, in fairness. So that's another instance of, it depends. And that's an instance where I would make a certain recommendation if that were the background information that I'm giving.
Sure.
But again, like that's something that I know Jermaine does on a daily basis, as do Mark from All Yeah and Sean from Fat Moose. And so again, my heart is always with comic shops. And if you have a local comic shop and it's a good one, and look, they're not all good ones. We've heard plenty of instances of people going into a shop and maybe they don't feel welcomed, or they're not helped in the way that you would want to be. So there are no blanket statements here, right? But give your local comic shop a chance. And I think more often than not, you'll be happy with the experience they have, or I hope so at least. And if not, there are other ways and other places to get this material. But first and foremost, I do always recommend that people start with their local comic shop, because they can do like what we're trying to do in this episode here of really kind of tailoring these, right? And offering some guidance that the DC app will, can really only do to a very limited extent.
And comic shops are just a special place. It's a whole vibe when you're there that you really do need to experience. And you owe it to yourself, especially if you're curious about comics, to experience. So I would agree with you very much that given your local comic shop and seeking it out if you don't know what it may be, is you can't go wrong, because there's so much. If it's a good comic shop, and I'm sure most of them are, it's a whole experience to be in there, just seeing everything that's out, all the statues, the toys. Just it's a whole vibe, and I think people would be making a mistake if they didn't take advantage of it.
Acme Comics is a locally owned and operated comic book store in Greensboro, North Carolina, for people of all ages and walks of life. With more than 40 years and a new second location to its name, Acme is a multiple-time Eisner Award nominee. The shop features a significant contemporary and vintage selection, as the Acme team uses their collective knowledge and resources to connect you with the best material. Mail order subscriptions to new releases are available, and all offerings are available anywhere via mail order. Follow Acme on social media and eBay, listen to the Acme Cast on all podcast services, and visit acmecomics.com for much more. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations: Harrison, New York, aka my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have kids and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and under new ownership since 2020, Moose sells a wide selection of comics from every publisher and time period, along with action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Yeah, so show your local comic shop some love. All right. The little game we made for ourselves, and Nick and I we've not compared notes ahead of time. We don't know what's on each other's lists. We could probably make some educated guesses. I'm sure there's going to be some overlap, but I don't know. I feel like we might surprise ourselves. We might surprise the audience a little bit. So the first budget tier that we went with was $50. So if you had $50, if you're new to reading Superman comics and you've got $50 to spend, how would you spend it? What are those first purchases that you would make? And as the guest, I want to let you go first.
Well, I think, for me, if we're working with $50 and you figure what the average trade paperback, it's $20. And I feel like that's on the low side
these days.
So
yeah.
if you're buying two, to say that you'd be spending $50, I think is very fair. So I'm left with two choices then. If I'm going to recommend trade paperbacks, which I am. I feel like there's books that are in continuity, that are the issued comics. And then there's Elseworlds tales that I feel like, really try in their finiteness to capture the essence of Superman, or to kind of put their mark on the character. So at the top of that list, for me, would be All-Star Superman. And I say that because in many ways, All-Star Superman, which came out in 2005 through 2008, really serves as a love letter to every era of Superman that came before it, including the death of Superman. In fact, there's an issue that spends the whole time watching Jimmy Olsen slowly turn into Doomsday. But also, it sometimes hits you over the head with its love for Silver Age, which admittedly, I feel like I'm going to spend the second half of my life. Once I turn 40, I'm going all in on Silver Age Superman, because admittedly, that's something that I just don't know very much about. But All-Star Superman, is known for gushing about, Silver Age Superman, Neil Adams era. And the second one I would recommend is, in continuity, John Byrne's Man of Steel from 1986. This was the book that famously rebooted Superman, for those who don't know, in the mid-'80s, and placed Superman smack dab in the middle of 1980s America, and did all these clever things within that, including having Lex Luthor be this Wall Street, kind of Trump mock, and kind of like a Gordon Gekko type, like Wall Street type, with, Gordon Gekko with kryptonite. And did a really great job, I think, of bringing Superman into 1980s America. But it does it in a way that doesn't lose any of like the sweet sensibilities that you think of when it comes to Superman. It's a very recognizable Superman that takes some creative choices. I think the most famous one is that Ma and Pa Kent are still alive as Superman ages and becomes Superman, and they're there as figures of guidance for him. So that would be my second choice within that tier. So it would be All-Star Superman from 2005 through 2008, and John Byrne's Man of Steel from 1986. Those first six issues collected.
Okay, very interesting. Now, I don't even know offhand, is Man of Steel, Byrne's Man of Steel, even available in an in-print edition in and of itself? Like, I know it's part of that new set of hardcovers, but I don't know, does it have a standalone that's still available? Not that disqualifies it as a choice, but that is kind of something else that I found myself bumping up against. And I tried to kind of modify where I could. At a certain point, I was just like, well, maybe your local comic shop has a copy, because there are a bunch of things that are on my list where they're not even that old, but I was looking them up and I was like, oh, I don't know that this is actually still in print.
Sure. Well, that raises another very good question. Where are you going to find these books? Because if you're going on eBay, they're everywhere.
True.
You could find a copy just like this for $20, $25. But is it available on Amazon.com, for example? It probably is, but through like the tiered sellers. I don't know that you could go to your comic. That's a good question. I don't know if you can go to your comic shop and find anything that's newly printed.
Yeah, I mean that.
Man of Steel.
Availability is definitely an issue, and it takes a variety of forms. When something certainly is out of print, but also like we were speaking about before, when a line of collected editions is started and then abandoned. So, just as an example, we had a question from one of our listeners here, and let me find. Okay, this is from Rob Matthews. He said, "This episode's a brilliant idea. What's the best way to collect the Jeff Loeb, Ed McGuinness era and other issues from that time? A lot of trades seem out of print, and some seem to have not been collected." Yeah, it's a problem. And that's I love the entire Triangle era, but that Jeff Loeb, Joe Kelly, we've done episodes on it. They were some of our earliest episodes. That holds a particularly special place for me. And they collected not
Our
everything.
Worlds at War.
Our Worlds at War, yeah. I mean, they collected not all, but a very substantial amount of that era of the comics in a line of trades with white covers and white spines. They're pretty distinct when you see them on the shelf, but they're all long out of print. And then within the past few years, DC started a new line of collections called Superman City of Tomorrow. And they were going through that entire Jeff Loeb, Joe Kelly era of the Superman books comprehensively and chronologically, collecting all of the issues from that time. And I was like, yes, like this is what I've been waiting for. A comprehensive, complete line and big, thick trades, $40 each. I'm like, yes. And they did 2 and no sign of volume 3. And I think it's been at least a couple of years, if not more at this point. So recently, I know DC put out a new collection of the Emperor Joker storyline where Joker gets a piece of Mxyzptlk's power and remakes the world in his image. It was definitely an iconic story from that era of the books. And they just put out a new deluxe edition hardcover of that, which is cool. I'm glad that they did that, but it's really a bummer to me that line of collected editions doesn't seem to be moving forward. So like to answer Rob's question, I don't have a good answer.
Yeah. And in DC, there's no shortage of examples of them doing that. Superboy, Trouble in Paradise,
the Peter David Supergirl 2 series.
Superman Blue. Well, I'm still waiting for.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to be waiting. So that's something that there's no, unfortunately, there's no shortage of examples of them unceremoniously, and I don't know whether that means that they didn't make the sales that DC felt merited another volume. Certainly a possibility, but we just don't know because they're not coming.
I think that it's a very difficult situation. I have thought and talked about this a lot, mostly off mic. We not really got into it so much on the show, but with any of these lines, another example, DC just put out Superman in the Silver Age Omnibus Volume 1. And I picked up a copy and I'm happy to have it. I haven't cracked it open yet, but I have it. Now, based on the other Golden and Silver and Bronze Age lines that DC has going with its various characters, I am cautiously optimistic that it will continue. But there's always a big question mark. And going back to what we were talking about with the Triangle era omnibus, if the sales aren't there, they won't continue. And that makes sense from their side, from the business perspective, but it puts the consumer in a tough spot because it's like, well, if you want to see more volumes, you have to buy it. But I'm taking a gamble because I don't know that I'm going to see this line completed. And so I might end up stuck with, to your point, Superman Blue Volume 1 of the Electric era. And who knows if and when I'll ever see Volume 2. And Is that the end of the world? No, at least you still have that. But it's just tough. I think it's just like it's asking a lot in it. It's kind of a tough calculus that everybody has to make.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, labeling something volume one suggests that there's going to be a volume two. So it's tough.
Yeah, but anyway, to Rob's question, again, there are those City of Tomorrow volumes 1 and 2 that are out. No sign of volume 3. That's an instance where I think the DC app is probably your best bet. Even there, though, there are some gaps, but you get certainly the period of time of that era where the books were working together and telling these big stories like that stretch is collected. I think it's kind of some of the Following Our Worlds at War where it gets a little bit spottier in terms of what's on the app. But we've been getting at this in terms of like what kinds of formats are we even recommending to people. And I think for you and I both, the trade paperbacks I think are probably the sweet spot. I do actually have a couple of omnibus editions in here, which I'll get to. I do not have on this list any single issues. But I do want to speak to that for a second here, because especially all of these past stories that we're talking about, yes, you could, in theory, try to track them down as back issues, right? When new books come out. So each of these comic book series, right, that are published, they're published on a monthly basis. And, Wednesday is New Comic Book Day every week at the comic book shop. And you go into the comic shop and virtually all of them, they're going to have this wall of new books, but then most of them will have back issue bins with older issues. So once they've been on the shelf on that wall for a few months, they come down, they get bagged and boarded, they get put in these bins. So not only will you find back issues in bins at your local comic shop, you'll also find them often at conventions. If you go to a comic book convention, dollar bins or more expensive books, you'll find a wide mix out there. And then certainly on eBay and elsewhere, you'll find old comics. Unless you really find the idea of a back issue hunt appealing, and you might, and I've done my fair share of back issue hunts, and they can be really fun. I've had a great time hunting down issues over the years, but that's kind of something that came over time. It wasn't like at the outset, I was like, oh, I want to hunt for back issues. I was also 5, sure, but still. But so for anyone listening to this, if the idea of driving around to comic shops and looking through the back issue bins and going to a convention and seeing what you can get and piecing together a run, like if that speaks to you, go nuts. But again, in terms of, I think, the kind of prospective reader that we're kind of addressing with this episode, that's probably more of a heavier lift than they would probably be looking to do. And it's not something that I would really recommend per se. So that's why where you and I think we're really gravitating towards these collected editions. I think that's the quickest and most cost-effective and efficient way to get these complete stories in one shot or in multiple volumes.
Yeah, I agree. I just think by the nature of them, it's going to be the easiest way to consume, especially if you're playing catch up. Because I feel like in a lot of ways, these, the Absolute Edition, a lot of these hardcovers and omnibuses, they're things that you can go back to, kind of like celebratory, like if you know that you're a big fan of something, you're going to go back and you're going to buy that Death of Superman, the $40 30th anniversary. Whereas someone who's never read the story, that may not be the way that they will, they may be curious. They may remember, oh yeah, Superman, Doomsday, Streets of Metropolis, but they wouldn't necessarily pay that amount for a hardcover book. I just think by the nature of trades, it's going to be kind of the easy way to go. Especially for out the gates.
Now you mentioned Silver Age. I don't want you to spoil the rest of this game here and your list, but do you? Well, I'll at least ask this: do you have any pre-crisis material on any of your lists?
No. In fact, I have to say that my Superman, everybody has their Superman, but my Superman begins in the mid 80s. I is the farthest back I've gone as a fan is Alan Moore's Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, which is the, what immediately, preceded Man of Steel.
Yeah.
And that's about as far back as I go. Like I said, Silver Age, the Neil Adams era, like the 70s Superman, like that's largely a mystery to me. In fact, I felt there was somebody I was talking to, like in the comment section of one of the posts, and I think it was about that Silver Age omnibus. that you recently got. I felt so inept as a fan because I couldn't keep up with him when he was talking about Silver Age. So that's going to be something that I'm going to have to discover as a Superman fan.
So I wanted to ask that, and there might be some pre-crisis diehard fans who are listening to this who are like, you guys, but I would encourage those folks, or you could take a step back, right, and think about a new reader, right, and how daunting this can be. And if you're, again, your primary exposure, I would imagine for most people, if you've experienced the character in other media, again, what are we talking about? We're talking about Smallville. We're talking about the Christopher Reeve movies, Lois and Clark, the most recent DCEU film, Superman and Lois. So kind of in that vein, kind of the way I'm thinking of it is, well, all right, like what, someone who's watched that stuff, like what might speak to them? And I've had a journey with the pre-crisis material. I've talked about this. I remember being a kid at the comic shop and trying with some of that older stuff and not connecting with it because the sensibilities are so different, and it was written for a younger audience and at a different time. And what eventually I was able to do, and it took a long time, really not until I started doing this podcast, to be honest, where I could kind of just appreciate it more for the historical aspect of it, and also just kind of not laugh at the stories, but kind of be able to take it in stride when something's a little clunky or silly or whatever the case may be, and just kind of appreciate it for what it was at the time and the audience that it was intended for. But that's something that came with time. And so would I say to someone, oh, run out and buy this Silver Age omnibus for $100 or whatever it is? No, I wouldn't.
That's so true. And that's going to be true for things that are very much on our list. Every third thing that comes out of Superboy's mouth, is cringeworthy. Like they were playing to like whatever, like the 1990s version of Zach Morris that all the kids wanted to be at the time. That's going to be true. That these are all moments in time, and I think you have to embrace that. I think you have to take like the silliness of each moment of time, and just roll with it.
Now, I've talked about this before. DC did a line of what I kind of refer to through the decades trade paperback. So they did Superman in the 40s, and then the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So you had this line of collected editions that was a curated selection of key stories from each of those decades in Superman publishing history. And they had, Mark Waid wrote an introduction, and there was kind of explanatory material throughout that kind of teed up the stories and gave you some historical context. Frustratingly, those are all out of print to my knowledge. I know fairly recently DC did a new edition with a new cover of Superman in the 50s. I pulled it up on Amazon a little while ago. I don't know that it's still in print, but like that's something maybe your local comic shop would have. It's not that old. And so this is not an official recommendation that I'm making. These are not on my list. However, I would love to see DC reissue these trades because I think they're very valuable. And I tracked all of these down on eBay when I started this podcast. And what's great about them is that they're curated. Again, you buy that Silver Age omnibus, you've got all the stories from a certain year period, which is great. But if you're really just kind of looking to explore and you're curious and you want kind of the best of the era or the most significant stories of the era, like the first Fortress of Solitude and the first Crypto and like the first appearances, especially, I think those decades trades are great. And it really bums me out that they're not readily available, because I think, again, for someone who's like, oh, I actually am kind of curious in pre-crisis, like that's the kind of stuff that I would love to be able to recommend and know that you have very easy access to these, but unfortunately we don't. But all that being said, I might have one pre-crisis thing on my list coming up later, but generally speaking, virtually all of my recommendations are going to be in this modern era. But again, if someone out there is like, no, like I'm really curious about Golden Age Superman, there are ways, omnibus editions and actually a new line of trades that's coming out, that DC Finest, which I want to talk about a little bit as well, where you can read that, but not going to be an official recommendation. But yeah, I was just curious your if any pre-crisis made it onto yours.
No, I'm sadly bereft of Silver Age, but
Totally fine. So, all right. So your pick. So All-Star Superman and Burns Man of Steel. So All-Star is on my list later. I will admit, I don't know that that's like one of the first things that I would give somebody. And I go back and forth on this because I agree with you totally. It is a love letter to the entire Superman mythology. I guess I just think about the journey that I had with All-Star Superman, where I think it took going back and experiencing a lot of those Silver Age stories and then coming back to it and having a clearer sense of what Morrison was tapping into. And it gave me a deeper appreciation for it. You don't need that though. You can totally read it without that. But to me, I kind of look at that as it's on my list. It's just a little bit later. I don't have Burns' Man of Steel on my list. I do have other tellings of the origin story. I get where you're coming from, and I totally get why you would include that on there. I think for me, I look at that as more historically significant than, hey, you got to read this. It's so great. But I know mileage varies, and that's just kind of a personal thing. But I very much respect your first two choices.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are mine? So the first three, and I cheated a little bit because if you tally them up, it's like $57. I went a little bit over, but I was able to finagle three.
Yeah, it's going to be impossible to be completely on the nose.
And I'm just going with the cover price, the actual suggested retail price that's on the back of the book. That, again, generally you'd be paying at your local comic shop unless they're running a sale, or if you're a subscriber at the store, you have a pull list, maybe you get some sort of discount, but I'm going by what the suggested retail price is. So I gotta say, man, like one of the thought of doing this episode, it had crossed my mind in the past, but I think one of the reasons I didn't move on it at the time was just, I don't want to be like a basic bitch with some of these recommendations where it's like the stuff that's on everyone's list all the time. It's like, it's there for a reason. So some of what I'm going to suggest, this won't be a surprise, but it's there for a reason. So number one, and we just did an episode on it again recently, and it remains kind of the book that I think you can give to anyone. Like if my mom said, I really want to read a Superman comic, this is what I would give. And it's Superman for All Seasons by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. This emotional retelling of the origin story that, again, it's so grounded and human and emotional. And with the exception of Lex's virus that plagues Metropolis, it's very grounded. Superman's going up against a tornado and a flood and loneliness, right? Like that's the story. And I think it just gives you a great sense of who this guy is and where he comes from in terms of his, not his alien origins, but his human upbringing. And it's so resonant. It's so moving. And I feel that way every time I read it, more so each time. So that's number one. My second choice within this $50 budget is, this will not surprise people, but another telling of the Superman origin story. Not that you need to experience the origin over and over, but at the same time, it is a natural starting point and it gives you the basis for who this character is and where it comes from, right? Superman Birthright.
Yeah, that's another. So, and that's by Mark Waid.
Mm-hmm.
That famously, I remember hearing before I had read it that it was going to tie into Smallville. And I remember at the time feeling irked by that for some reason. Like it was almost like it was, okay, the comic's trying to cash in on the success of it. But when I actually read it, it shocked me at how it's like a blink and you'll miss it tie where Clark tries to shake Lex's hand and says, it's been a long time since Smallville, Lex. And unblinking, Luthor just changes the subject, refuses to shake his hand, and acts like he didn't even see it. And that's it. And beyond that, it's just this rich, wonderful telling, placing Superman. And, it came out shortly after 9/11 into a post 9/11 America, and did it in a really rich way. With, again, I referenced before when I talked about Burns' Man of Steel, like that inherent sweetness to the story of Superman doesn't lose any of that. And the art, I mean, what can you say? It's just astounding. In fact, there's pages, towards the end of the story where paging through, and it's like when that creature, when the the crab-like Kryptonian creature comes to life. It's like you're seeing pages from a movie come to life in front of you. And I hadn't felt that way since, strangely enough, I read Kingdom Come, where it was like I was so impressed with the art. It was like I was watching a film, literally, as I turned the page. So love that that's on your list.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think it is a cinematic version of the story, and the thing that has always resonated with me is that it takes the time to explain why he would adopt this dual identity, and it shows him traveling the world and taking that step. And I think that's a very worthwhile aspect of the origin story to explore. And the other thing too, again, I love For All Seasons to death, but that one really is focused on the emotion of it. So you don't get the Kryptonian side like at all. So Birthright, I think, gives you a far more complete telling of the origin, and you get all the major beats and the aspects of the mythology. It's just like, it's all there. It's been a favorite of mine for years and remains so. And that's one of the ones that I would put on the list. They recently put out a 20th edition hardcover.
I saw that.
Yeah. Of course, unsurprisingly, is more expensive. I think that version is, I don't have the price offhand. That might be $50 or in that range. But the version I have is a $20 soft cover that, again, I don't know if it's still in print, but hopefully, if nothing else, you can find, at your local comic shop, or if you don't feel like springing for the hardcover, but if you do, I think you're in for a very satisfying reading experience. The third one within this $50 budget, $50+ budget, is a little surprising even for me, because it's not necessarily like, oh my God, this is one of my all-time favorite stories and I've been reading it forever and I've read it over and over, but I do think it's very strong. It's very, very accessible. The accessibility, just in terms of a new reader, I think being able to sink their teeth into it, I think that value is really high with this. And that's Tom King's Up in the Sky, Superman Up in the Sky.
Yeah.
And I read that for the first time really just, I don't know, a year or so ago when we covered it on the show, but I found it just very engaging. I feel like it really taps into a lot of the core qualities of Superman as he's tracking this, a girl who's been abducted by aliens. So it's this journey across the stars to rescue this young girl, and the little adventures that he has along the way, and these little vignettes essentially that put him in these different situations and challenges, and you see how he responds to them. And again, just those underlying qualities that propel him forward throughout. I feel like it's just a great meditation on the character. And unlike the origin stories that I've already cited, this is Superman full-fledged in his role. So you really get to see him fully formed on this grand adventure.
Yeah, and it doesn't skip on that writer's fever dream. That's what I kept on saying to myself as I was reading it. It's just like his approach, where it's like you just find yourself, or you find Superman in like these narrative instances where you see, like, they mine the DC universe and the people he meets along the way. So that's another really great one.
And I'm not, no disrespect, I'm not the biggest Tom King fan. I think more often than not, when I've read his stuff, I've just come away feeling like, I don't know, that his style is for me. I'll just leave it at that. But this was one that I was very pleasantly surprised by. One that's not officially on my list, but his Woman of Tomorrow, Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow, I really enjoyed that. And we know that's going to be the basis allegedly for the upcoming Supergirl movie. So, that's one that, again, not officially on the list, but, like if you end up reading Up in the Sky and you're like, wow, this is amazing, and you also kind of want to have some background for the upcoming Supergirl movie, shift right over to Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow. There's, I think, a pretty affordable trade paperback that's probably in the $20 range. And then I know not long after this recording, I think they're putting out a deluxe edition hardcover that'll be in the $50 range. And when it comes to something like that, I don't necessarily recommend springing for that deluxe edition, especially if it's something that you haven't read and you don't know if you really like. It's like, spend the $20 on the soft cover, because in case you don't like it, it's less of a gamble. For me, when I will go for the omnibus or the deluxe edition hardcover, or although I don't own any absolute editions, but like For All Seasons is one that I would happily own. It's when it's something that I know I love and I've spent a lot of time with it, and I want to have it in the best possible format. But short of that, I think like that $20 trade, you're in great shape. This episode made possible in part by educator, hobby comic book collector, and pop culture enthusiast Sam Lim. Sam is based in the South Jersey area and is looking to connect with other comics fans as well as retailers. They're also looking for comic shops to explore, so recommendations are welcome. Be sure to follow Sam on Instagram at SZL Comics to see their latest comic pickups and shop adventures. I'm a proud backer of the Paragons of Earth comic book project, now available to support on Kickstarter. The creative team of Percival Constantine, Thomas DJ, and Eric Johns have plucked forgotten Golden Age superheroes from the public domain, reinvented them as their own sort of Justice League, and put them up against a Lovecraftian apocalypse. Back this project and learn more by going to percivalconstantine.com/paragons. Also, Perry, a multiple-time guest on Digging for Kryptonite, hosts the Superhero Cinephiles podcast about comic book-inspired films. Be sure to listen wherever you get podcasts. We reference the television series Smallville a lot around here, and there's one Smallville rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor as they discuss each and every episode of the series that ushered in the renaissance of superhero TV. Listen to Always Hold On to Smallville wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On to banner, including Arrow, DC's Legends of Tomorrow, Superman and Lois, and Star Wars. All right, so that's our $50 budget picks. So now kind of the next tier, and these tiers were suggested by James when he reached out on Patreon. He, to his credit, he was like, you could do a trilogy of episodes at the different levels. I was like, I don't know if I could do 3 episodes, like, but we could do one.
I don't know, we might have to.
We might know. But all right, so now we kind of open this up to 200. Now, we didn't talk about this ahead of time, and I was kind of debating this with myself because now that we're in the $200 budget, are we just adding $150 worth of books to that existing list, or is it like a separate $200 list? I
think it's like, look at it like the Big Bang, where it just keeps expanding.
That's how I approached it. All right, good. All right, so what's on? So now we've spent $50 right on these initial picks. Like, so now we're expanding our budget. We have another $150 to play with. What are you adding?
This is one that is near and dear. I have literally a Kingdom Come tattoo on. This is the best image I can give you, unfortunately.
That's amazing.
But it's there. I absolutely adore Kingdom Come, but it wouldn't be like it's one that I would not have as like your foray into Superman. I feel like you need to kind of get to know Superman for Kingdom Come to work. I'm sure if somebody picked it up blind without knowing who the character is, there's still things to appreciate. But I feel like once you kind of have your own relationship through reading a book or two of Superman, it's time to graduate to Kingdom Come. Kingdom Come, which features a Superman in his late 50s with graying temples, and who is coming out of a 10-year exile. And I'm not going to spoil anything around that. I know it's pretty well trod probably to most of your listeners, but it's kind of a big part of the story. So if we really are suggesting these to people, I won't ruin that plot, but it's about Superman coming out of that 10-year exile where no one has seen or heard from him. It's Superman's The Dark Knight Returns, but it's so much more than that. I don't want to just regale it to being just kind of like Superman's Dark Knight Returns. It's so much more. And it's so rich. Mark Waid, the writer, was chosen specifically for this just because of his vast knowledge of the history of DC. And boy, does it show. And of course, Alex Ross's art. Alex Ross, he's an artist who, I was fond of before I knew who he was, just based on the Superman Doomsday and Beyond for young adults, which is the novelization for young adults of the death and return of Superman story. Alex Ross, 3 years before he became a household name with Kingdom Come in the comic book world, did the cover for it. In fact, I have it on my wall. That's how much I love it.
Your point is very well taken, though, because I'm glad you said that, because there might be someone out there listening to this who is versed in the comics who's like, yeah, like Kingdom Come was the first thing I read, or Superman Red Sun or Superman Secret Identity. And if that worked for you and that got you into it, awesome, right? Everyone has their own entry point to all of this. But I'm with you. I would not recommend, taking a story that kind of subverts the Superman legend and turns it on its head as your starting point. I think it's much better. And clearly this lines up with the advice that we're giving here of you build that foundation first, right? You get that understanding of who that character is. Then you could take a look at some of these stories that challenge that. And then I think you get more out of it. So I agree with you. Like, we picked different origin stories for our first tier, but we both, at Man of Steel, I had For All Seasons and Birthright, but we both still started with takes on the origin. And then it's like, now you get to something like Kingdom Come. And it's like, well, okay, now you see this character way down the line. And like you said, he's exiled himself and what's happened and what brings him back and what goes from there. But yeah, I would not start with that. So I think like that's a very appropriate place to put it. Totally.
It's like watching Rocky 1 and then going right to Rocky Balboa. There's a lot in between there, but if you watch one and the last, it actually works.
It does work. And Stallone has. I have to do a Rocky podcast, but like Stallone has said as much. And talking about Rocky Balboa,
I have a figure right here, brother.
This is a tangent, but they just announced they're doing a Rocky Balboa director's cut coming to 4K.
I saw that.
And Rocky 5. I mean, I'm less intrigued by that.
I'm the dad who took my 8-year-old son when they did the Rocky 4 director's cut, and it was in theaters for like 2 nights. I was there on my birthday with my 8-year-olds.
Oh, that's oh my God, that's another connection point here. That's amazing. But I can't. Rocky Balboa is my all-time favorite movie. It's just my favorite movie. But Stallone has talked about that, where he's like, his intention was that you could go from Rocky 1 to Rocky Balboa. Just watch those 2 movies and you get a complete story. And I don't disagree with it. Anyway. But
same could be said with Superman.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So what else do you have on this next tier?
For All Seasons. The wonderful sensibilities of Tim Sale's art. When this came out, he was immediately following up at, Long Halloween, which is one of the, Nolan based his, the Dark Knight famously on that plot. So they were already huge. So it was a big question. Okay, what are they going to do next? Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. For All Seasons really had no right to be as wonderful as it ended up being, because again, it was like they're soft. It's like, what are they going to follow up Long Halloween with? And what they end up doing in Long Halloween is dark as dark gets. It's where the I believe in Harvey Dent line came from, was mining from that darkness. And what they gave Superman was so sweet and so much the opposite of that. And so much what it needed to be to stand on its own legs, as a wonderful work of art by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. And again, you put it so well, in your description of it. So anything I say is going to be hyperbole in comparison. But just to build on what you were saying, it tells a really great, sweet origin story. And by the way, I've been challenged that For All Seasons is an origin story recently on Twitter or X.
Oh, I saw. I remember you not long ago. You posted like, "What's your favorite?"
I posted, and a couple people said, "Well, I don't know if I would consider it an origin story." And I'm having it on, like thinking, like, okay, what mental gymnastics are you doing for it not to be? So I feel like it very much is. Yeah. But I just thought I'd throw that I had been challenged recently that it's an origin story.
All right, like we've talked about this. The way I look at it, and ultimately, I think it is. I do think there's a distinction you can draw. And the distinction I've drawn is I feel like we have Man of Steel, Birthright, and Secret Origin by Jeff Johns and Gary Frank. And those are like the start to finish full tellings of the origin. Then I think you have something like For All Seasons and something like American Alien, which again, I refer to as these emotional retellings where they're showing you Clark at a formative stage in his pre-Superman and early Superman days, So it taps into aspects of the origin story, but it's not giving you kind of like the complete picture that those other three do. So again, I think ultimately, like, they are all origin stories, but I just think there's a difference between the full origin versus the emotional one and these kind of like, personal vignettes. But anyway, that's my take on it. But they shouldn't have, they don't need to come at you on X over that. It counts.
They're always coming. and I go above and beyond to keep my posts controversy free, but it still weasels its way in sometimes.
Look, we just did 3 episodes on the Snyder movie, so I was like, well, here we go. It's like, here we go.
Well, I wish I could have been there for that, because I love the Snyder movies. It's just and I'm also chomping at the bit for Superman 2025.
Yes, we can enjoy both. It's allowed.
it's allowed, but I'm not going to say I didn't. See, that's the thing. It's like those Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and Zack Snyder's Justice League. They came out like from my 20s into my 30s. So like as I became a father, like those were my DC Superman movies. So I have an emotional attachment to those two, admittedly.
Right on. All right. So Kingdom Come, For All Seasons. What's next?
Next is going to be Superman Exile. Check it out. Right here. Came out in 1989. This is back when Jerry Ordway, who was both writer and artist at the time, he later turned that over to Doug Hazelwood and Tom Grummett, who took over art duties. But this is when Jerry was on sole art duties for Adventures of Superman and sole writer. So he was this was his pre-death kind of quarterbacking the early Triangle era. It wasn't the Triangle era yet, but it was close. And Superman Exile tells the story of Superman once again in a self-imposed exile in space. And we find out kind of along the way in the opening why. And the why behind Superman being in exile is because he recently took the life of General Zod and his 2 accomplices. So Superman takes to space, racked with guilt over kind of, basically executing 3 Kryptonian villains after they killed what he says is billions of people on a planet. And it's Superman just, it puts the why, and this is something that I've thought about a lot. And Superman's no-kill rule. God knows there's 1,000,001 schools of thought, and I'm that one. So this is mine, that, Superman had to experience the ugliness of taking a life, or deciding that justice was taking a life, and finding what the why inside of himself. Like, why does Superman not kill? Why does Superman have this no kill rule? And in it, there's this beautiful moment where Superman, standing up to the tyrant Mongol, screams, "I'm Superman and I don't kill." And he says it with such firm, like he believes what he's saying. And the book is Superman traveling in space on this Odyssey journey to find out what kind of superhero, what kind of Superman he's going to be when he returns to Earth. And he finds that within himself. And it's a wonderful, wonderful story. So it's very much on my list.
It's tremendous. So this was before we officially had the triangle numbering, but we were kind of building towards that era of the books. And the trade that you held up, that's, if I'm not mistaken, that's long out of print. So I don't know how.
Oh, sure. Certainly. That's 1996.
So I don't know how easy a time people would have. Although, like we're saying, if you go on eBay, or you might have some luck at your local comic shop. When I was visiting we went to visit my mother-in-law in South Jersey a while back, and I don't even remember the name of the store, but there's a local comic shop there, and they must have taken in a collection of old trades recently. But they had them all out, and there was a lot of, I didn't pick up anything because there was nothing that really grabbed me, but but I'm seeing a lot of out of print trades that like you don't see in stores often. So, even things that we're kind of citing as examples that, yeah, you might not be able to get as easily as something that's currently in print. You still might have some luck at your local comic shop or at a convention, but let's put a pin in Exile because we'll circle back to that. But I agree with you for all the reasons you said. It's a tremendous, tremendous story. And if you're going to tell the story of Superman killing, again, I'm not in the camp of like, no, you just can never tell that story. It's like, no, if you tell that story, like tell it in a way where, there's a payoff to it and there's some kind of takeaway, and this gives you that for sure. So that's a great pick. What's next?
The next one would follow up that. Now this comes pre-death. This is Superman Panic in the Sky. Panic in the Sky is important because it's the story that's the biggest story that's told pre-death of Superman. And it basically cements Superman as the leader of the then DC universe. So when the death comes, which is going to be my next pick, you really feel the loss. And it pits the Justice League led by Superman against Brainiac. And Supergirl's very much in play. The Matrix version of Supergirl. And it's a great one that, immediately precedes the death of Superman story that, again, when we get to the death of Superman, really makes it feel earned.
So now you said that's your next one. Now, I guess my main question, I have no question about why you would suggest that. I feel like that goes without saying, but like what version or what edition do you recommend?
The collected edition of the 7 issues of the death of Superman story, just to close out this tier, to end it on a cliffhanger. I'm not going to call it the best, but I do think it's the most monumental Superman story told in our lifetime, certainly.
Bias aside, given how much we love it and how formative it was. But no, I was really thinking about that. It's like, yeah, I mean, I genuinely think that is the most significant story in Superman's publishing history.
Well, you think like, thousands of years ago when they were telling stories about Hercules, in the Greek gods, they didn't know at the time that we'd be sitting here, in 2024 referencing them. For all we know, in 1,000 years, they'll be telling their version of Superman versus the monster Doomsday.
Yeah.
This is modern mythology. And I feel like every once in a while, somebody hits a home run for the mythology. And I think there's a reason that the death of Superman's been with us and continues to be with us for so long. I think it is special. I think they did, Superman, who literally put the super in superhero. I think they hit a home run when they told his death story and subsequently his return, because they could have fumbled that too. It could have been a one-off issue, but they took their time over a full year to let that story unfold and make it be earned when he did ultimately return.
I think that's one of the key aspects of that was the duration, the fact that you had these different acts to the story where you had the death, you had the funeral, you had the reign, you had these multiple creative teams, each with their own style. And especially when we get to Reign, focusing on a distinct replacement Superman, but still all working, in lockstep with each other to tell this, cohesive, consistent storyline across all of those many months. And when you look back at pre-crisis stories, even the most significant ones, in most instances, an issue, maybe a few issues, especially as you got maybe more into the Bronze Age, you'd have multiple, a storyline that spans multiple issues, but most of them were one-offs, by design, and that, that worked for that time. But I think the amount of time that you were and the amount of real estate that was devoted to this story, and the fact that it was told as well as it was with the different segments to it, I think really does put it in a very special category. So, yeah, no, I would never dispute its inclusion here on your list. So that closes out your $200 tier.
Yep.
All right, so definitely a theme here. I know a few of those came from this triangle era and thereabouts period, which I have so much love for. All right, so for me now, so essentially adding another $150 worth of books to what we had previously laid out in terms of For All Seasons, Birthright Up in the Sky. Now what comes next? So one of the next things that I'm going to suggest, I'm not necessarily going in order here, but the Warworld saga, the recently concluded Warworld saga from Action Comics, written by Philip Kennedy Johnson. And that was collected. It was initially collected in a number of smaller volumes, and then they put out this compendium style collection of the entire thing. And it's this thick, a comprehensive trade paperback that gives you the entire saga. I don't have offhand how many issues it is, but I don't know, 20-ish. I mean, it includes the main storyline and some of the one-shots and annuals. And one of the reasons why I included here is that a lot of the stuff that's on this list, I went with a lot of kind of self-contained things, right? And they tend to be shorter in length, which I think can make it more digestible, and especially for a new reader, I think is a good place to start. But there is something, and kind of building off of what we're saying about, the death of Superman, about really being able to sink your teeth into and settle in with this sprawling story. And I think Warworld Saga is so recent too. And that's another reason why I want to hear, because it's like, we're talking about a lot of these classic stories, but this is something like just wrapped up. And I think is genuinely compelling about Superman taking his team, these authority members, this team to Warworld to try to liberate the planet, and finding that not only is there this physical hurdle that he needs to overcome, but ultimately a spiritual one, where the people have been so beaten down by Mongul that they don't want his help, that they cheer for Mongul in the arena. And so it's not what he thought it was going to be. It's not just showing up with his team and beating up Mongul and everyone's happy and we call it a day, but rather there's a deeper, more philosophical, fundamental battle that he has to wage here for the soul of the people. It's a great story. And again, the entire thing is collected it is $60. So that's a bit of an investment, but I think you get your entertainment value from Warworld Saga. Next up, All-Star Superman. So it was only a matter of time before we got here. Like I said, not in my initial tier, because I do think it plays better when you have a little bit more of a foundation in the character. Not unlike, I know, we talked about For All Seasons and in Kingdom Come. I actually kind of look at For All Seasons and All-Star Superman. I think you could kind of bookend those two and kind of look at those together. It captures so much of the spirit and the history. And it also, I think, walks a great balance. We've talked about Grant Morrison's work a lot, and Morrison can be kind of out there sometimes. But I think this is one of the ones that kind of walks a nice balance, where you get a lot of those big Morrison ideas, but in a more digestible way. It's not quite as out there as maybe some of their other work. So I think it really strikes a nice balance. I think there's a reason why you see this included all the time on the recommendations, and it's one that my love of it has grown immensely.
And and thinking about it, if I were to ever retweak my list, I think it would make sense, because, like I pointed out, with so much of it being a love letter to Superman lore that's come before, it would be good to know. I feel like if you haven't read any Superman, a lot of that will be lost on you. So I think you're wise in a way for having it later in your list.
But it is one of those things that I know people do jump to that to recommend, and like it's all well and good. But yeah, I that's one that I kind of hold back on. And I wonder if someone jumps into that too quickly, if it will have the effect that it could have. So that's why I put it in this next tier. The next one is Superman Batman Volume 1 by Jeff Loeb and Ed McGuinness and Michael Turner. So they've collected this series. This was the early 2000 series, and they've collected it in various formats. But I guess one of the most recent versions, and the one that I have, they collected essentially a year's worth of stories at a time. And this Volume 1 collects, again, the first year of that title, the Public Enemies arc with McGuinness on art, and then the Supergirl arc with Michael Turner on art. And they are so fun, so readable, so momentous. They deal with Lex's downfall as president. This is during that era of the titles. It brings back essentially the pre-crisis Kara Zor-El version of Supergirl to the comics. The art with McGuinness and Turner is just out of this world. And the Superman Batman dynamic is we've spent time on it very recently on the show. And I think it's again, foundational to the DC universe. It's such a core relationship and partnership. And what Loeb is able to do with these stories and kind of showing you how well these guys know each other, and we get these dueling narrations and you just see how differently they operate, but how well they complement each other. And they're so fun. And the next volume, which covers the Absolute Power and With the Vengeance arcs, it's solid. But this, if you were to get the Superman Batman Volume 1 with the Public Enemies and Supergirl arc, because I think it's a banger and you'll have a great time with it.
Oh, 100%. And, I think as a Superman fan, if you're doing it right, you need to have a healthy appreciation for Batman. And the other side of that coin is, nothing miffs me more when I see a Batman fan disparaging Superman. It's like they're are you kidding? It's like they're two peas in a pod. It's just like you have to have a healthy appreciation. And I feel like that book, the way it depicts their relationship, and in the thought bubbles as they talk about each other, it's like you're watching Lethal Weapon. It's amazing, but at the heart of it is this friendship and this caring for each other. So I think it's very, very wise that it's on your list.
It had to be there. It's from a very formative time in my reading, but trying to be as objective as possible. I think it's, again, especially I'm really trying to put myself in the position of someone who's like really just not like, this world is kind of foreign to them. Maybe they haven't read comics at all, or they haven't read Superman. And I think this is one that is just, you'll have a great time with it, but you'll also get great insight into the characters. So that's on there. Right. The next one. So I debated this because I don't think this edition is currently in print, but it's, to me, the best collection of this material. And it's the last, then this is very specific. It's the Last Son of Krypton trade paperback by Jeff Johns with Richard Donner, and drawn by Kubert and Gary Frank. So it collects, when Jeff Johns was on Action Comics post Infinite Crisis, this collects two essential arcs: the Last Son storyline that Richard Donner co-wrote with him and Kubert drew it, and the Brainiac storyline that Gary Frank drew.
I love that.
And there were other stories in between. I mean, most notably, there was a 3-part Escape from Bizarro World story, which is a lot of fun. And there was a Toyman one-shot. But this trade tease up the new Krypton storyline, which we've talked about. But you can read this Last Son of Krypton trade paperback in and of itself. And particularly, if you're a fan of the Reeve movies, I think you'll have a great time with this. Again, Richard Donner is a co-writer on the first arc, and Jeff Johns clearly a huge fan of that iteration of the character. And it really, I think, both visually and in terms of tone, takes a lot of its cues from the movies, which, to be honest, is something I've wrestled with. And I wrestled with it when it was first coming out, because I was like, hey, this doesn't necessarily feel like my Triangle era Superman so much. But now I can kind of take a step back and appreciate it for what it is. And I think it's a great, fun, self-contained story that, in the Triangle era, you and I love it to death. And for better or worse, there were a lot of things that were off limits to the creators. And so you had these different takes on Zod and Supergirl and Kandor, and arguably lesser takes. I don't know, mileage will vary and everyone has their favorites, but this now starts bringing back, over the course of these two arcs collected in one trade paperback, you get the quote unquote true version of Zod, of Kandor, of Brainiac. I mean, it's really kind of restoring these iconic versions of these elements.
Which, other than maybe, Jim Lee, I'm drawing a blank on it, For Tomorrow.
Yeah.
That's the only time that we had seen Zod before that. Now, you may know something that I don't. Was Zod off limits to the Triangle era?
Yeah, I mean, the idea was that, and this is my understanding. If anyone knows differently, tell me. But my understanding is that,
Superman had killed him.
Well, but Superman had to be the sole survivor. But I mean, that Zod that he killed was from that pocket universe. I feel like they were really splitting hairs here, where it's like, they just introduced different versions of these characters. And it's like, no, they weren't literally from the same Krypton that Kal-El was from, but it's still these characters. But yeah, they were from that pocket universe. And so was Supergirl. She was that protoplasm that then merged into the Danvers and became the Earthborn Angel. It's like, all right, you know, it is what it is. It's very specific to that time. I have a lot of love for it, but
those are Gary Frank's beginning.
That's true. Yeah, for sure. And then there was a Zod that was like the son of Russian cosmonauts in the Joe Kelly time on Action Comics. And then the one that we got for tomorrow. So there were like a few quasi Zods, but this brought, the Zod back. So again, that Last Son of Krypton trade by Jeff Johns, like I think that's a great one that you can really just kind of latch onto. And this was something else that I wanted to say for people who've been listening to the show, as like fans who really follow this stuff, one of the things that I think we drive ourselves a little crazy with sometimes is trying to make sense of the continuity and the fact that we've had all of these different eras, and then we've had reboots and we've had crises. I mean, we went through all those crisis events and my head was spinning. But here's the thing, and this is the positive, and this is what I want to say to the new readers who are going to go out and buy some of these things that we're recommending here. And by the way, we're not affiliated in any way with DC Comics. We have no cut of any of this.
No.
So there's no agenda here. Honestly, I really just want to help to whatever extent we can. I think the best thing, if you're coming into this new, don't worry so much about the continuity and what era you're in, right? Everything we're talking about, right, has been so post-crisis, but then there's post-crisis that leads up to Infinite Crisis. Then there's post-Infinite Crisis to New 52. Then there's a New 52 era. Then there's Rebirth. My best advice is look at each story or run that you might pick up as a different Superman TV show or movie franchise, right? Because that's a frame of reference that I think people are comfortable with, right? Like, I don't know that anyone watches Smallville and then watches Superman and Lois and it's like, what the hell is going on? Like, I don't understand. Like, it's not the same. It's like, they're different interpretations. And I think that's kind of a healthy way to look at this. And there are certain things that, well, like Kingdom Come, for example, right? Like that was purposely initially this out of continuity tale, right? So that was meant to be its own thing to begin with. A lot of these other things that we're talking about were meant to be in continuity, and they were for a time, and then maybe they weren't in continuity anymore, but don't get hung up on that. I think really just any story, any run that you're looking at, just look at it, like I said, as just its own TV show, its own movie franchise. And one of the reasons why you don't need to get too hung up on it is that even for people like us, like we've spent so much time with this, it's still not crystal clear in certain instances about what falls where. And I think even for DC Comics, I think there are certain things they don't have an answer for, so don't worry about it. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Many of you have already used this code, and I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I'm Marshall and she's
Courtney, and we're your hosts of Blurred Watchers podcast here on the Pop Break.
Come hang out with us as we discuss, cross-examine, theorize, summarize, and review our favorite offerings.
And tangents, there will be tangents, whether it be live, streaming, or anything in between. If we watch it and think it's cool, we invite you to come hang with us as we all talk about it.
Our episodes post every third Monday on the Pop Break podcast feed.
See you there. Bye.
Filmmakers and movie fans alike should be sure to attend these film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and Round Reel in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Take it from an alum of two of them. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network.
So what's our next tier?
Well, I had one last one for this $200 tier, which is New Frontier, which is not truly a Superman story, though he has a pivotal role in it. But it's my favorite, other than Death of Superman, which is very personally significant. New Frontier is my all-time favorite DC Comics story, and we talked about it for its 20th anniversary. And I think the art is, Darwin Cook's art is out of this world. It's so clean. It's so dynamic. And the historical setting of it puts an entirely different spin on it. And I think one of the things that's kind of beautiful about the story is that if you have history and love for the DC characters, you can appreciate it on a different level. But if you don't, I genuinely think this story gives you what you need to, and you can just buy into the drama of it all and watch it all as it unfolds. And this can be your introduction to the DC universe and its characters and its teams. And you see the formation of the Justice League. It's an all-timer, and you really can't go wrong with it. So New Frontier, that closes out my $200 tier. Did you have anything else in the 200 or no?
No.
Okay.
I have, now our next tier does it bring us to 500?
Yeah, our next and final tier, 500. And here's the thing, and everyone's in a different situation. And I'm also not saying, hey, go out and like slap down $500, right? Like if that makes sense for you, it's like go nuts. But this could be something that's just kind of over time, but it's meant to kind of provide some kind of guidance. And we've talked about digital and the value that can serve. The other thing too, I always want to mention this because I often forget about it. And it's not a resource that I always utilize or that I really have at all on the comic book front, but your local library. You know, we're talking about buying all of these things. And if you can, great. But if you can't, go to your local library, see what they have. I think I would venture to guess a lot of what we've been mentioning, especially these like real heavy hitter, classic evergreen books, they'll probably have. So check that out as well. But yeah, our next tier is 500. So we've now, Nick and I have each spent $200 with everything we've listed so far. Now we're going to open up the budget and we have $300 more to play with for our final tier of 500.
Okay. I might save them some money. I don't know if this rounds out to 300, but I'm going to close out with 2 omnibus choices.
Me too.
No, I know.
I did the same thing. We did not plan this ahead of time.
It's because again, I feel like if you get an omnibus, it's kind of celebratory. So my first pick, my last one was The Death of Superman. I have to say that if you have the means, go for the Death and Return of Superman omnibus. Like I said, it's big and thick, and reading it may feel a little bit cumbersome. But to have, if you're going to collect a piece of Superman history in an omnibus format, it would have to be in my mind, The Death and Return of Superman. It collects news snippets. The latest edition collects news snippets of the times, sketches, rough drafts of Doomsday and the 4 Supermen that came claiming that they were Superman, returned from the dead, the whole story. And even far beyond, they include the full issues of the 4 or 5 issues that came after Superman was back. So you're seeing Superman, do the Coast City cleanup. You see a bit of the Azrael Batman. So you get a little piece of the Nightfall puzzle in there. So I feel like it's just so important. I know we've waxed poetic about that and gushed about it a lot in this, so I'm not going to do too much more, but I would say collect that. My next omnibus choice would be the DC Rebirth to follow up the Death and Return. If you know anything about DC Rebirth, if you don't, it is the pre-crisis Superman. So the Superman that fought Doomsday, the Dan Jurgens, as I call it, Superman, makes a return. And you see Lois, and they have a 10-year-old son named John. So in so many ways, it's like revisiting old friends. If you really adore the Triangle era, the Death of Superman era, World of Superman, Rebirth for me was such a gift. And you see so many people, and it's literally like catching up with Superman and Lois many years later in 2016, over 20 years after the events of Death and Return of Superman happened. So it's so great. So for me, that's like, it's like my feel good place, Rebirth, which is why I was so sad to see it go. But it's something that I like to often revisit. And I feel like it would be a great way to follow up Death. Like, the heaviness of the Death and Return parried by the lightness of Superman and Lois raising a young son, but still not sacrificing any of the action, because boy, there's a lot of it, and a lot of Superman's rogues from the Death of Superman era, like Cyborg Superman, the Eradicator, Doomsday. They all make appearances, and it's done in a way that's by Death of Superman writer Dan Jurgens. Like, he doesn't disappoint. So that would be my choice to round us out.
Right. Wait,
would be Superman Rebirth.
But wait, is this the Peter Tomasi, Pat Gleason run, or the Dan Jurgens Action Comics run?
The Dan Jurgens. This would be the Dan.
Oh,
Jurgens
they did it. I didn't realize they did an omnibus of that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, right on. I'm going to cut in from the future here with a quick fact check, not unlike the narrator on Arrested Development. Unfortunately, I'm here to burst everyone's bubble. So a Dan Jurgens Rebirth era omnibus sounded too good to be true, and turns out it was. So there is an omnibus for the Peter Tomasi, Patrick Gleason run on the Superman title during the Rebirth era. However, as of now at least, there is no omnibus for the Dan Jurgens run on the Action Comics title during Rebirth. However, Jurgens' run has been collected in a number of formats. If you want to go the hardcover route, you want to look for Superman Action Comics, the Rebirth Deluxe Edition hardcovers, volumes 1, 2, and 3. And really, to set everything up, you would also want to grab the softcover edition of the Superman Lois and Clark trade paperback by Dan Jurgens and Lee Weeks, which introduces John Kent and reestablishes the pre-crisis version of Superman prior to Rebirth. And if you don't want to go the hardcover route, the run is collected in multiple softcover editions as well. Okay, just wanted to clear that up. Back to the show. Oh, so again, funny enough, I went in the exact same direction with two omnibus picks that tally up to $275, so I had a little more room to play with. But the Superman Exile and Other Stories omnibus, which is $125, and again, so essentially it collects what's in that trade you showed us before, but more of what came before and after. So you really get kind of the larger scope of that period of time. That omnibus has been out of print, but is coming back this fall. They're doing a new printing. It's $125. It's look now that we're getting into omnibus territory, we're going out on a little bit more of a limb here, but I think for both of us, not to speak for you, but it's like, we do genuinely believe in this material, and like, I would not say, hey, go out and buy this if I didn't think the stories were worthwhile. And while these shorter kind of single volume books that we've been talking about are great, and that, I think that really gives you lays great groundwork, right, for you with the character. These now are opportunities to really dig deeper and to spend more time and to really settle in with a long run of issues, which I think is a really special, fun part of all of this. So sure. Exile and Other Stories. And then if you really love Exile and Other Stories, get the Triangle Era Omnibus. There is a little bit of a gap in between the two of them, which we're hoping that they're going to do like a Road to the Triangle Era Omnibus or something. But
there always is.
That little gap is difficult, but still, to go from Exile to the Triangle Era Omnibus is great. Though I'm not going to go so far as to put the Triangle Era Omnibus on my list officially, only because I have to reserve one of my final slots for the Death and Return of Superman Omnibus. I don't really have much more to say about it than we haven't said in this and so many other episodes, but it's it's personally formative, but it's so formative for the character, both the character's history and the publishing history of Superman and DC Comics. And there's a lot to enjoy. And especially the funeral segment is very, very moving, very emotionally resonant. It's, I think, such a critical piece of that entire saga to see the world in mourning. And then it's just like this blockbuster action and mystery with the 4 replacement Superman. Like, it's that, I think that's the thing about it too, is that like I said, there's nothing more to say, and then I had more to say, but it's just that there are these different flavors to the story. It's not just one thing. So that is $150. So again, I know these are not small purchases, but in terms of the quantity and quality of material that you're getting, and really diving into a very significant period in the character's history, I genuinely think it's worthwhile. And then I have a little bit of money left to play with, so I'll include Kingdom Come there for the reasons you said and that we've talked about recently. And my love of it has grown a lot recently. So that takes us to $500. Real quick, I had a couple of honorable mentions. Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, the final pre-crisis story of the character, like I talked about, I mean, I read that like pretty cold as a little kid, and like didn't know much of like what the context of it was, but I still found it very engaging.
Sure.
And now that I know more what it was about as this final pre-crisis story that wraps up an entire era of the character, I love it even more. But I would say, like, if for anyone out there who's like, I'm really curious about pre-crisis, but again, I can't get any of those through the decades trades because they're all out of print. And I would say Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. It's a truly great story.
You can't go wrong.
I would also say, if you love DC The New Frontier, check out Superman Space Age, because it's a similar kind of deal where you're seeing a Superman story told in a different historical setting, right? This time, the space age of the 60s. So I think they are kind of like spiritual companions, and you might get something out of that. We had a last couple of questions from audience members here that we can just kind of do as a quick lightning round, and then we can sign off. This was from another Nick, one of our patrons, who said, we talked about these, Superman in the 40s, 50s, 60s, those trades. He said, it's a travesty that we don't have a Superman in the 90s trade paperback. And he said, I mean, this is kind of a big question, but like, what issues would you include in a Superman in the 90s trade? I mean, while that percolates, let me just say this, because I've had more time to sit with the question. I think what's hard about Superman in the 90s compared to the other decades trades is that, like we said, in the pre-crisis era, they were largely single issue stories. So you can pick a bunch of them and it all works. With the 90s, what was beautiful and magical about that time, what we loved so much, is you had this ongoing weekly adventure, and not that there were no one and done stories. There were some one-offs, but
Sure.
For the most part, it was more about them being part of this larger story. So I don't know. It's like, I guess my question for you is like, do you try to find some of those one-offs, like a Metropolis mailbag issue, and use that? Or do you just pick something from a larger arc, and that's just kind of like the representation of that arc?
Immediately, the issue that comes to mind is Superman number 68. And if you look it up, it's this tremendous Dan Jurgens cover of Superman and Deathstroke. And it's again, a finite story. Again, at a time where they were doing these overarching stories throughout, the series in months and months. This is a finite story. So there are little moments that I like. And for whatever reason, that was the issue that came to mind when you said that, just because I love the art, and it captures just a specific moment in time, which, is pre-death 1992, Dan Jurgens and Brett Breeding pumping out the hits. So yeah, there are issues that come to mind for that. But it's not something that I really seek out.
So this actually kind of ties into, we had a question from Craig Byrne of Krypton Site and K-Site TV. He asked what we think of the upcoming DC Finest line of collections. Have you followed that at all by any chance?
I've not, no.
The short version is it's kind of sort of like Marvel's Epic line, where they collect these big chunks of a character's history. One of the things that I've always loved about the Epic line from Marvel is that they jump around. So they're not beholden to going in order chronologically, but they kind of have it all mapped out. So you might get volume 14 and then like years later, they'll go back into volume 11, but it's like, it's great. And so what drove me freaking nuts about the DC Finest announcement is that on the Superman front, they're starting with the first like 20 issues of Action Comics. And I'm like, God damn it. Like, guys, how many freaking times are you going to collect this same material? We've had the archives, we've had the chronicles, we have the omnibus, which I have. I got it in my head that like, I want to have this library of the Superman publishing history. And so I bought the 7 Superman in the Golden Age omnibus books, and they're on my shelf and they're gorgeous. And I still haven't opened them yet, but I have them. And I dream of a day when the entire Triangle era is collected and we have all that. But with the Finest thing, it's like, we've had this material collected. And I think this is why, when we talk about this business about lines being discontinued, it's for reasons like this. Because people, I mean, I'm going to rant for a second here. I'm sorry, but it's like people who want the Superman Golden Age material have it. They have the archives, or they have the chronicles, they have the omnibus.
I think that's a safe bet by now.
So it drives me nuts that they're starting with this again. Collect material that hasn't been collected before. with other characters, there's a little bit more of a mix. And there's a lot that's still kind of a question mark. Like there's a Supergirl one that, if I'm not mistaken, it's got like a Silver Age cover, but then the description is like the Jeff Loeb series. So it's like, what the hell is actually collected in this thing? But so that's my frustration with the Finest line, but I'm cautiously optimistic, and I hope they pull it together, and I hope we see a variety of material collected. And that's why, going back to Nick's question about a Superman in the 90s, yes, I agree. I feel like they left something on the table by not putting one out, but at the same time, where I want to see DC focus their attention is on those Triangle era omnibus collections. That's where I want all the 90s material collected.
And commit to it. Let's see volume 2.
Commit to it. Exactly. So listen, man, this was so much fun. I thank you so much. And one last one, we had another gentleman on Twitter who said, this is from Curtis Scott. He said, this is literally what I've wanted of this episode. He said, I'm new to comics. All of my Superman experiences have been TV shows and movies, and I'm curious, where should I start? So Curtis, and to anyone else in that camp, and James, who suggested this initially, I hope we've helped answer that. And this was such a blast to have you on here, and I really appreciate your time.
Oh man, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for having me, Anthony. We covered a lot of ground, but we had a blast doing it. So would love to do it again.
Well, it's funny. James suggested 3 episodes, and for most other podcasts, this duration would have been 3 episodes, but we do it in 1.
There's a lot to mine from.
Absolutely. Where do you want to direct folks? You want to direct them to your socials or anywhere else?
Nick Farina on Twitter, at Nick Farina.
Right on. Well, honestly, man, this was the first time you and I met and spoke, and it was a blast, and I know it won't be the last time. So I thank you very much, and happy reading and collecting as you continue your Superman fan journey, as I do as well. But this was an absolute blast. So thank you. Thank you, audience. As always, I always appreciate you tuning in. Make sure you come back next week. And until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. Be sure to check out our sister podcast series, Another Exciting Episode in the Adventures of Superman, an episode-by-episode breakdown of the classic George Reeves television show, available wherever you get podcasts. Please join us on social media, become a patron, and subscribe, rate, and review today. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all.